South African delegation is here in Astana from 9th of November till 14th of November. They're here to, on the occasion of the 5th round of bilateral consultation between the Republic of South Africa and the Republic of Kazakhstan. And within the framework of the visit, the South African delegation came with an intention to meet with our students, which is, I guess, a great opportunity for the future specialist in international relations. The delegation is very highly presented, and I would like to introduce members of the delegation we are happy to meet at the university. Professor Anil Sooklal, the Deputy Director of Director General of Asia and the Middle East of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation of the Republic of South Africa. Mr. Yandis Mpunza, Public Diplomacy. Ms. Nchali Patience Kozo, Public Diplomacy. Mr. Daryl Neil Hudson, Department of Trade and Industry, Director. Ms. Lu Afan, Deputy Director, Middle East and Central Asia. And Ms. Haya Sishuba, Director, Bilateral Relations. And His Excellency, our Ambassador to the Republic of South Africa, Mr. Khalif. If to introduce Mr. Ambassador Sooklal, I would like to say that he is responsible for Asia and the Middle East, Department of International Relations and Cooperation. In addition to his duties as Deputy Director General, he is also South Africa's BRICS Sherpa, the South African Sherpa for G20 and national focal point for India, Brazil, South Africa, and Indian Ocean Rim Association. He is also currently acting as Sherpa for both G20 and BRICS. And we are thanking His Excellency for his intention and that he came to meet our students. And now I would like to give the mic to His Excellency Ambassador Shrish Soni, the Ambassador of South African Republic in the Republic of Kazakhstan.
Thank you very much. Good morning, students, academics, head of faculties. For us, it's a great honor to have someone like Professor Sooklal with us today, who can share with you the discussions on BRICS. Now, he leads South Africa in the BRICS, so he's familiar with all the meetings that take place throughout the year and the meeting of the heads of state, which happens annually. I don't think you'll get a better or more qualified person to speak to you on BRICS. So I do hope that you enjoy the lecture. I do hope that you learn a lot from it. Please feel very free to ask Professor any questions. He is the body of knowledge on BRICS. What I would like to do is to ensure that Professor Sooklal does come to your university once a year for a short lecture on such topics. We learn a lot from him. He's my boss. I come to him, and I'm sure the university and the students and academics will benefit in engaging with Professor Sooklal. Thank you.
Anyway, so it's a great honor for me, and I think for the university, to host Ambassador Sooklal, one of the most prominent South African ambassador, diplomats, I would say. I think doesn't need any sort of introduction. So since he's leading person in the BRICS process, which is growing geopolitical reality of our days. So I do believe that Ambassador will share his vision, the vision of his country, what's going on inside the BRICS, what this BRICS is about, especially in the light of the recent BRICS summit. Thank you so much. Ambassador, the floor is yours, please.
For giving me this privilege this morning and for honoring me with your presence. Mr. Vice Rector for International Relations, Madam Dean, Professor, my good friend, Ambassador Khaliev and Ambassador Solny, students and members of staff of the Eurasian University. I always like coming to universities because I spent the first 12 years of my career teaching at a university in South Africa before I was recruited to become a member of the South African government when we got our democracy in 1994. And the reason why I liked coming to university, Madam Dean and Mr. Vice Rector, is that you always remain young because you're among young minds, vibrant minds with new thoughts and new energy. So even though you age as a professor, and had I been still lecturing at the university, I would have been an old professor now. But I would have been young in thought and young in mind based on the vibrancy that exudes from the youthfulness of students. You are always full of new ideas, new energy, and new ways of doing things. So don't think that you only benefit from the lectures you receive from your learned professors. You also teach your learned professors by bringing new ideas, by challenging their thoughts, and by having vibrant and robust discourse with them. So I'm extremely privileged this morning to be able to share with you some thoughts about this family that we call the BRICS. Now, very briefly, I have a presentation, and my colleagues always at the university and at the Department of International Relations say that they take a lot of time to prepare a presentation for me, and I never refer to it. But the reason I do that is to make them work also. If they don't do it, then I will be accused of not challenging them as well. So please, I will leave the presentation to you. I may refer to it, but let me just share with you some thoughts about what BRICS is about and what BRICS mean to the BRICS country, what BRICS mean to the global community, and what are the recent developments within the BRICS community. Now, if you speak of the BRICS country, as you are all aware, this term was coined by Jim O'Neill, who worked for Goldman Sachs around 2001, observing what was happening on the international scene in terms of emerging market economies. He coined the term BRICS based on what he observed on the role of an emerging group of countries, namely Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Now, I always maintain that Jim O'Neill is given credit for coming up with this acronym BRICS, but the idea of what was occurring at that time in global politics, in global economics, and global finance was nothing new. If you look at the 1998 World Bank report, it actually focuses very sharply on a group of 5 or 6 countries that were breaking a new growth path. And specifically, it was China. China, as you know, in the 90s, after its opening up under Deng Xiaoping in 1978, started growing at a very fast rate, and by the mid to late 90s, it was growing at double-digit figures. India, under the former Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, in 1993, opened up to the global economy, and you had a more liberal approach to the Indian economy, and by the late 90s, India was starting to grow significantly as well. Likewise, you saw that there were some dramatic shifts in Brazil, based on the pain that Brazil faced in the 80s. Then you had President Cardoso that came onto the scene, stabilized Brazil, and by the time President Lula entered the scene around 2001, 2002, you had a vibrant Brazil overcoming the difficulties of the 80s. You saw the same in Russia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and glasnost, perestroika Under Gorbachev, you had a very difficult period in the transition of Russia finding its foot in the global scene. Under Boris Yeltsin, it was a very wobbly period of, and I'm not referring to his liking vodka, but it was an unstable period in Russian history. But when you had Putin coming onto the scene in the early 2000s, you had a different Russia emerging on the global scene. So all of these countries, and the other country that the World Bank referred to was Indonesia. Indonesia also was suddenly starting to grow very significantly, having had a long period of stagnation. But by the time Jim O'Neill coined this phrase, Indonesia was undergoing internal political turmoil. You saw that the regime of Suharto had come to an end due to popular uprising, so you had some political turmoil there. And I suppose because of that reason, Jim O'Neill left the fifth country that the World Bank report referred to and spoke of these four. Now, as I said, by the early 2000s, you had very significant developments in all of these countries. Likewise, you also had a very significant development within the African continent. In 2002, the African Union was launched at a summit of what was previously called the Organization of African Unity, that was formed in 1963. But in 2002, the Organization of African Unity transformed in what we now refer to as the African Union. And of course, there was a history to this. The OAU, from its founding in 1963, was very much focused on the political emancipation of those African countries that were still under subjugation and under the shackles of apartheid and racism. So by the time of the launch of the African Union, every African country, well, with the exception of Western Sahara, which is still today under dispute, you had every 54 members of the African Union politically emancipated and now focusing on economic and social development of the continent. So you had this transition, a very exciting phase also in the development of Africa. So, of course, these countries were a group of new emerging market economies that were starting to challenge the status quo of the global geopolitical landscape. If you look at the global geopolitical landscape, from 1945, when the UN was formed, until about 1975, when the G7 was formed. G7 was formed in 1975, that brought together a group of major developing countries with major economies that were dominating the global landscape. From 1975 to about the beginning of this new millennium, the global landscape was dominated not as it should be by decisions taken within the multilateral system, the UN, and all of your associated multilateral bodies, but agenda setting in terms of the global economic financial space and the global political space was set in the G7, and much later on in the 90s, when Russia became a member, became a G8. But we know after the Ukraine problem, Russia is out of it, we're back to a G7 configuration. But what it did is that when the G7 met annually, this was the most important meeting that took place on the global scene. Everyone watched. Far more important when the General Assembly met annually. You had far more focus on the G7 summits than your annual UNGA meetings. And this carried on for over 2 decades, where the global agenda was set by this group of 7 countries. Now, of course, with the emergence of new players on the global scene, the dramatic growth that we started experiencing in the countries that I have mentioned, China, India, Brazil, and Russia and others, the global South recognized that they need to jockey for their space in terms of reconfiguring what is happening on the global space, and that they could not just be followers led by a group of 7 countries. And the idea of a G-South was already percolating for some time. In fact, South Africa had taken the lead in 2001. It was our former president, President Mbeki, in discussion with some other heads of state, who floated the idea of creating a G-South. And a group of 7 or 8 countries had got together to look at the possibility of creating a global bloc that champions the interest of developing countries, the South. and not be dictated to by the agenda as set by the G7. So this group of countries were invited to a summit that was supposed to have taken place in South Africa in October. It included all of the BRICS countries. It included Malaysia, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, as amongst the group of 7 or 8 countries that were invited to South Africa to come to a ministerial meeting to discuss the creation of a G-South. Unfortunately, that meeting didn't take place because 9/11 occurred. And you know, 9/11 became a very important point in modern history in terms of the direction the global political landscape would evolve in the coming decades. And we are still reeling from that event. So that collapsed. And then you had the idea, of course, of Jim O'Neill floating the idea of BRICS countries. The first meeting of BRICS countries, just the 4 of them, without South Africa, took place at foreign ministers level in 2007. In fact, this year, there's an annual meeting of BRICS foreign ministers on the margins of Unga. And this year we had the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the meeting of foreign ministers. So BRICS has been together as a bloc now for 10 years. So although we have just come out of the 8th summit. At summit level, it was only in 2009 that you had the first summit hosted by President Medvedev here in Russia, in Yekaterinburg. That was the first summit in 2009, followed by a summit in Brazil in 2010. But of course, what started out as an informal grouping soon after, with the first summit taking place, the leaders of the BRIC countries decided that we need to configure ourselves into an organized forum because we all share the same aims of working towards, as a collective, transforming the unequal global architecture that we have on the political front, transforming the global financial space, dominated still by the G7 countries and your Bretton Woods institution, and of course transforming the global trade space where even though the Doha round was launched in 2001, you know that up to now we've still not achieved agreement on the Doha round because it was a developmental round. So even within the trade space there was domination by a select group of countries. So it was these common objectives that these countries shared, that they decided that if we collectively pool our voices and collectively pool our efforts, we'll have a far more greater impact on the global stage in terms of transforming, for example, the UN, including its Security Council. We celebrated last year the 70th anniversary of the UN, and the UN is unchanged in 70 years. The Security Council is still made up of 5 permanent members. And the reality of 1945 is far different from the reality of 2015. And yet we find ourselves with that same configuration of countries, many of whose economies today have been surpassed in size and in scope and projected growth of emerging market economies. So it was these issues that gelled this group of countries together. In 2010, South Africa made overtures to the BRICS countries to say that, look, we'd also like to be part of this family because you have been recognized now as a global power bloc. And you cannot be complete without Africa being part of that equation. And having spoken to all of the BRICS countries, there was unanimous agreement that you need an African voice in the BRICS group of countries. And naturally, they all agreed that that should be South Africa. So on the 24th of December, South Africa was formally invited to become part of the BRICS. And in 2011, South Africa attended the first BRICS summit, which was the third of the BRICS summit, which took place in Sanya in China. And that's how South Africa became part of the BRICS. And the small s in the BRICS acronym became a big S, even though we are the smallest member in terms of economic size, in terms of population. Now, why should you have such a configuration of countries? Is it good for the global community, or does it undermine existing multilateral structures? Let me say at the very outset, the BRICS group of countries, as I said, came together drawn by a common purpose in terms of finding a space on the table that has been controlled thus far by a select group of countries, and that makes decision on behalf of the global community. And we were saying that as developing countries, it is important that we act together to say that you cannot continue business as usual. We live in a very changed and transformed age, where you have a China today. Many refer to China as an emerging power. China is an emerging power. Of course, the Chinese wouldn't like to say that, but that's a fact of reality. I mean, China's economy is the second largest today, $11.3 trillion economy, second to the USA only. In terms of nominal GDP, it is the largest global economy today. In terms of PPP, it's the second largest. India today is a major economy. It's a major entity. The BRICS countries collectively account for over 40% of the global population, just over 3 billion people. Now, like you, I was also a student of politics and history in the early 80s. And I recall my professors when I was a student of Asian history, when they spoke of India and China, they spoke of poor, underdeveloped, overpopulated countries. That was the term used then, overpopulation. You'll never find that word today. In fact, when President Modi, when we were in Goa now for the 8 BRICS Summit, he said, I greet you on behalf of 1.25 billion Indian people. President Xi, when he speaks, he says, I greet you on behalf of 1.3 whatever billion people. So population has become the equivalent of a power statement. When you say, I represent 1.3 billion people, that's a statement of power. Yet a few decades back, it was a statement of underdevelopment and poverty. So this is how the global political environment has changed significantly over time. Over 40% of the global population, firstly. Secondly, the GDP, collective GDP of BRICS countries has grown significantly over the past number of years. Today, the GDP of BRICS countries in terms of nominal GDP is around 25% of global GDP. In terms of purchasing power parity, it's around 22%. The projections are that by 2050, the BRICS GDP will account for just over 40% of global GDP. And this is a prediction from IMF. Goldman Sachs has the same prediction, and various other think tanks will give you about the same statistics. That of the top 10 global economies, 4 of them will be BRICS economies. By 2030 and 2050, the equation will still be the same. China will be number 1, India number 3, Brazil around 4, 5, and Russia predicted around 6 or 7. South Africa will be at the position of 25 by 2030 and remain at around 25 at 2050. We are a small developing country of 55 million people, but one of the most diverse and strongest of economies on the African continent today. Now, of course, as I said at the very outset, BRICS was not created to undermine any bloc. The question is often raised, don't you think by having a group of countries such as the BRICS, you're undermining the UN system, you're undermining multilateralism? We are very clear within the BRICS that we have come together to strengthen multilateralism, because multilateralism and the UN system has been eroded over the past number of years. With all due respect to Ban Ki-moon, who takes him seriously? Who takes him seriously today? That's unfortunately the tragedy. It's not about Ban Ki-moon as a person, but it's about the UN system as it exists today. Because the UN system has become paralyzed. And how do we unlock this paralysis? You can only unlock this paralysis if you reconfigure an archaic, outdated UN hierarchy that was created in 1945 based on the realities of 1945. You cannot have that reality dominate the global space in 2015 or 2020 or 2030. You know that the reform of the UN debate, the working group has been there for the past 15, 16 years and made no progress. No progress. Because it's very much like South Africa. When you have power, you don't want to give up power. The apartheid regime knew that it cannot sustain itself forever. But it grabbed onto power for as long as it could. It didn't want to share power with the majority population in our country, knowing that it's an unjust regime that relegates the majority population to the periphery of our society and denies them their fundamental rights and freedoms. But that could only sustain for a certain period of time. It eventually had to collapse. And if the UN is not reformed, no one will take this body seriously. Already there's erosion of it. You have got your G7, you've got your BRICS, you've got your G20, and more you see what is happening with the G20. When I was at the recent summit now in Hangzhou in China, one of the complaints that's come through is that the G20, we have mandate creep. In the G20, which following the financial crisis of 2008, was supposed to be the preeminent financial group to see how we restructure global finances and the global economy. But G20 is no more focusing on that. If you look at the G20 agenda today, it is everything that is there is beyond just finance and economics. They've even starting to institutionalize a foreign ministers meeting. Germany has called the first high-level meeting as it takes over the presidency in January, is a meeting in mid-February of foreign ministers. Because increasingly you have issues that's outside the pale of finance and economics, but becoming part of the G20 agenda. We saw it here in St. Petersburg in 2013 when Russia hosted the G20 summit. If you recall that President Obama has said that Assad has transgressed the US red line, and they were on the verge of bombing the Assad regime. The US and some of his allies, supported very strongly by Cameroon and a few other EU countries. For the first time, Putin put on the agenda, on the dinner table discussion, the issue of Syria. And the BRICS countries as a collective, supported by other developing countries within the G20, said that that is not a solution. A military solution will not give you a resolution to Syria. Bombing Syria will not happen. Obama had to step back because the majority of the G20 countries, led mainly by the developing members of the G20, indicated that they will not support a unilateral action to remove Assad. So it entered the political space already there, and it continues to do that. Now, within BRICS, we say that we are there to complement efforts to strengthen multilateralism, but not to undermine it. So therefore, when we say that we want to see a reform of the global architecture, a reform of the UN, a reform of the working methods of the UN. I mean, you would have seen now the appointment of Guterres as the successor to Ban Ki-moon as Secretary General. For the first time, there was a far more open and transparent process, a process not just left to the P5 members within the Security Council, but the General Assembly debated and made inputs into the choice of the new Secretary General. Why should it be in this day and age that the managing director of the IMF and the head of the World Bank must rotate between the EU and the USA? These are global institutions, global multilateral institutions. But yet, in this day and age, you can only become head of those institutions if you are either a citizen of the EU or the USA. The fact that the Doha round is paralyzed after 15 years of negotiations and calls for many of the developed countries to abandon the Doha round. Why? Because it put development at the center of the global economy. That's why you see a whole range of proliferation of regional trade agreements, your TPP and so forth. I don't know what's going to happen to TPP now that Trump has come to power, because he he campaigned that he will not endorse the TPP and that he will reverse that decision. So we live in a very interesting times, but it's a time where there's a contestation for power. And BRICS is saying that we need, as a collective voice, to ensure that in this new reorganization of the global power table, that it's not dominated by a select group of countries from the North, that the voice of the South must be equally heard, that decision-making must be transparent and must include the countries of the South. And this is what the BRICS is about. And many countries have indicated that BRICS has a short shelf life. In fact, if you read, there's a vast volume of literature, almost on a weekly basis, coming from a number of think tanks, from a number of publication houses, mainly from the North, that have written the BRICS off. You've had serious fault lines in many BRIC countries. Last year you saw the stock market turmoil in China. Its foreign reserves was just over 4 trillion. Today it's about 3.2 billion, over 600 billion flight of capital. China was speaking of the new normal as it seeks to reorientate and reorganize its economy from one that was investment driven to one that is more domestic driven, and that's being called the new normal. China is still growing at about 6.7% expected this year, last year 6.9%. You saw the Indian economic engine finally kicking in, growing at about 7%, expected to be about 7.6, 7.7%, and perhaps 8% next year. Now when you speak of growth in these economies, even China with its slowing down, you must remember it's growing at 6.7% of $11.3 trillion economy. That's a massive growth still. You must see it in ratio. Or India growing at the rate of 7.6% of a 2.3, 2.5 trillion economy that it is today. That's a massive growth. Now if you look at the last quarter of growth in the EU, I was traveling to one of the countries in the region, and I picked up the Financial Times when the last quarter figures were released, and there was a great deal of buoyancy because the German economy grew by 0.4%, and they made a big issue of that. But China was growing at 6.7% or India at 7.6%, you hear nothing of that. But a European economy that grows by 0.4%, that's a major growth. And this is the lopsidedness of how the global media projects what is happening in the developing world as against what's happening in the developed world. And that's again the domination. When you speak of global domination, it's not just about the global politics, it's the global media space. It's to do with every aspect of our life and how it is reported. And this is what BRICS is trying to do, is to bring sharp focus on all of these and challenging the status quo. And BRICS don't claim to speak on behalf of the countries of the South. We don't have such a mandate. We speak on behalf of ourselves. But what we do champion is the issues that are of common interest to the South. And that is why when the summit was held in South Africa in 2013, when we had the opportunity to host the summit, we started an outreach process. We invited the African Union and all of the heads of the African regional communities, some 15 or so African leaders, to come and dialogue with BRICS, to say how is it we can work together. And that tradition was continued. In the following year, Brazil hosted the Community of Latin American States. The 12 or 13 leaders came and dialogued with BRICS leaders. Last year when Russia hosted the summit in Ufa, you had the CSO and the Eurasian Economic Community as dialogue partners to see how we can work with the partners from the regions. And this year, when India hosted the 8th BRICS Summit in Goa, they invited the leaders of the BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal initiative, that came and dialogued. Your president was last year in Ufa. President Nazarbayev was there to attend the BRICS Summit and interact with BRICS countries. And in each instance, when BRICS has met with the regional partners, there was absolute support for the positions that BRICS taking and encouragement that we need you to champion these issues because they are issues of common interest to us, and they also encompass what we'd like to see in a organized and realigned global economy. Now, I constantly say to the question, but you are so diverse as 5 countries. You are highly diverse countries. What do you have in common? But the reality is there's far more points of intersection between the 5 countries than points of divergence. That's the reality. And we see it. We have a large number of working groups. What you see in the global space is the annual summit. But in between annual summits, for example, Russia last year hosted 81 meetings during the presidency, and India this year, I think, by the time they finish the presidency at the end of December and hand over to China, would have hosted close to 100 meetings, sectoral meetings at ministerial level, at expert level, and ultimately at summit level. The most visible result of the coming together of the BRICS countries has been the creation of the new development bank headquartered in Shanghai. You would have seen that in a very short period of time, the idea arose at the summit in 2013 that India hosted. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, former Prime Minister, put out the idea that why don't we pool our resources and create our own bank to fund development in our countries, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to get funding for developmental issues from the IMF and World Bank. Let us pool our resources and create our own facility. And in a very short period of time, within 2 years, that bank was launched with its headquarters in Shanghai. And you would have seen in April this year, the first tranche of loans were disbursed for projects, green energy projects in all 5 BRICS countries. And they're busy finalizing the second tranche of loans, which will be dispensed early next year. Also, the first green bonds in renminbi was launched in August this year. It was subscribed by, it was launched to the value of 9 billion yuan, but it was subscribed to by over 30 billion yuan. So that was the first green energy bonds. You're going to see bonds in other currencies within the BRICS countries in the coming years. We're also looking at a rand bond from within the bank. We will shortly also open up the first regional center of the new development bank. On the 6th of December, our President Zuma, will officially launch the Africa Regional Center of the BRICS New Development Bank in Johannesburg. So that will be the first regional center. So that's the most visible and tangible area of our cooperation, the bank. We also created a contingency reserve agency agreement, which is a social safety net for BRICS countries, that if any one of us get into fiscal difficulties, given the global financial challenges, we don't have to go to the World Bank, we don't have to go to other agencies to seek capital security. We can do this from our own pool, the contingency reserve agreement that we have signed. So these are the most tangible and visible issues that we have brought together. We are looking at trading in our own currencies among BRICS countries. You know that on the 1st of October, a bit of history was made, but no one made any noise about it. The global press was almost silent with the renminbi becoming part of the SDR basket, your global financial currency reserve. You hardly read about it in any paper. But I recall in 1999 when the euro replaced the French franc and Deutsche Mark as the new currency in the SDR basket, every one of us knew about it. We all knew there's a new currency on the global stage called the euro, and it is now part of the SDR basket. But yet, you had the yuan becoming part of this, and I think we all should be proud. It's the first time since the SDR basket was created in 1979 that you have the currency of a developing country being part of the SDR basket. And what is also significant, the weightage of the yuan is heavier than the Japanese yen and the British pound. That is significant. You never read about that in any newspaper. But that's a very significant development. It didn't just join the basket as the new currency with the lowest weightage. It joined the basket as a new currency with greater weightage than the yen and the British pound. Now, of course, this is significant for us as developing countries. You have now a currency from a developing country in the world that can be part of the foreign reserves, and it will continue to grow. The recent BRICS summit, what we do set for ourselves when each country becomes presidency and take over the chair of BRICS, the focus area. There is continuity in terms of the plan of action that we adopt, but they determine the theme and the focus area. So India chose the theme of building resilient, inclusive and collective solutions. They very creatively played on the BRICS acronym. And basically, that is what BRICS is about. It's being inclusive. You have to look at inclusive growth today. You have to look at inclusive development. If you look at the developmental challenges of all of the BRICS countries, we have similar challenges. If you look at the political challenges, we have similar challenges. Now, there's a great deal of resistance to the existence of BRICS. There's constant undermining of BRICS countries. You see political turmoil in a number of countries, the isolation of Russia. I'm not going to comment on the right or wrong of what happened between Russia and Ukraine, but there's collective punitive action by a group of countries on Russia. I always say to the Europeans, I served 6 years in Brussels as South Africa's ambassador to the EU. So I say to my EU colleagues that you had an opportunity to deal with Russia differently. But what you did, you chose to isolate Russia and to humiliate Russia by expelling them from the G8. You don't deal with a country that has a proud history like Russia has, the way you have dealt with Russia. You have dealt with Russia very wrongly. And all you have done is actually boosted President Putin on the global stage. President Putin is a global figure today, for whatever the reason may be. His role in Syria, whether we agree or disagree with it, but he's a key player in what happens in Syria. And what happens in Syria impacts on global security and global politics. It's not just about Syria anymore. You know that. I know that. We all know that. That Syria is more than just about Assad. It's more than just about ISIS. It's a contestation for global power that's taking place there. What happened in the Philippines with China and the South China Sea and the arbitral ruling on it is more than just about Philippines and China. It's far more than that. So all of this, we live in a very interesting political space. And with the developments in the USA over the past day or so, it's going to become increasingly more interesting. So those of you that are in the sphere of international politics and economics and so forth, you are living in exciting times because it's a very challenging time. There's a lot of gray area. I've been dealing with the Middle East for almost 2 decades now in our ministry. And I say to my colleagues that every time I visit the region, it gets more and more complex. You can't see through the haze of what's going to happen in the Middle East. Nor can the countries themselves. You know, South Africa is a key champion of Palestinian statehood and sovereignty. But I keep saying to you would have seen 2 days ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu outright rejected the approach by Pierre Vermont, who's the French special envoy on the French initiative to deal with the Palestinian issue. He said, no, we'll not be party to it. So the French initiative is dead. You cannot have a discussion on the future of Palestine without Israel. And of course now with Netanyahu, with Trump coming in, Netanyahu is feeling very strong. So therefore he can take such drastic decision. But these are issues that BRICS also concentrate on, the geopolitical issues that impact on global security. In the the Goa Declaration, there's 6 paragraphs just dedicated to global terrorism. Because global terrorism is a global problem today. No country is immune from the impact of terrorism. So a significant amount of the focus at the BRICS summit was on terrorism. And what can we do as a collective in terms of addressing this global challenge to us? So the BRICS agenda concentrates on the key issues that I've mentioned to you in terms of the global challenges we face on the political front, including global hotspots, like the situation in Syria, like the situation in some of the African conflict zones, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and so forth. We also reflect on the reform of the IMF. We also reflect on what can be done as a collective to fast track and push the UN Security Council provision. and of course, issues of common concern to the BRICS countries in terms of the developmental challenges. How can we pool our resources to assist each other in addressing the issues of poverty, underdevelopment, and job creation? Common challenges for all of us. So colleagues, this in a nutshell, I've just given you a brief window of some of the issues that's under discussion within the BRICS and why the BRICS exist. We believe that we are a significant entity. As much as many have written off given what has happened in Brazil, Brazil will come right. Brazil in the 80s was almost a failed state. It's too big, it's too powerful, and an economy to fail. You have your internal challenges. Whatever happened to Dilma Rousseff, whether it was regime change or whether it was popular will or whether it was through outside manipulation, Brazil will bounce back. Russia will bounce back. It's too powerful a country to write off. Russia will bounce back. That's why I gave you the prediction of where Russia will be, where Brazil will be by 2030, 2050. Go and check any of your think tanks and read about the global economy, the global world, where we will be in 2030, 2050. Russia and Brazil will be in the top 10. China will be there. India will be there. These are significant countries that you cannot discount. But let me thank you for giving me this opportunity and privilege. I know I've taken a lot of your time and spoken more than I should do. But you know, I'm always accused of, as a former academic, we like talking. Too much perhaps. Thank you very much.
Only on BRICS, but on global policy, which is extremely important for both for our students and for our staff. And here we do have two representatives, as BRICS stands for 5 countries, of two of another BRICS countries, India and Russia. Associate Professor Dr. Puneet Gaur and Associate Professor Andrei Sheinin. I would like to ask them to talk further or maybe give their very brief remarks.
Under the BRICS summit, there is 2 or 3 more important issues we have raised over there: that world security, environment, and UN Agenda of 2030. As Jinping statement over there is that there are more challenges we are facing in that particular period of time of in economics areas. So we have to come out over there. It is really very sad to know that we are not giving some more space to terrorism over there, and we should not create some kind of consensus which Modi want to be created on that particular part, that we should have come together to have some kind of a memorandum about that particular part. But at the outskirts we have some words over there about the terrorism. We have some consensus over there that we have to meet these kind of challenges over there. And very importantly, very key challenge is that for point of view of the South Africa is there in BRICS summit in that particular area, is how we can industrialize the Africans countries over there. So we are more focusing on that, about the part how we can create the industrialization of African countries, which is in coming years, are the very significant and important part of that BRICS. And thank you again, sir, for an excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
You know, in Russia, despite our difficult situation in the economy, many officials and experts absolutely agree that we have to unite. That BRICS is a way to reverse the strength of Bretton Woods system. Bretton Woods system it became unfair and unjust, you know, and it's more profitable for development countries, despite than emerging countries. So Russia is greatly support BRICS, and we hope that our nation, our union, will help our countries to overthrow all challenges that we are facing now, like terrorism, like Bretton Woods system, as I told, and so on. Thank you.
But before we will move to the Q&A session, I would like to remind that the whole conference, the whole seminar was recorded and would be available tonight on G Global, which is the initiative of our president. And the global idea, as we do have in Kazakhstan, some of the initiatives, so as Expo 2017. 2017 will not just end with 2017. It is planned that in 2019 it would be transformed to a global initiative, global communication platform. So there, one of the first lectures which are recorded and represented there would be the seminar which we're having now. Thank you. And now if there are questions from the students, professors. Please, Andre.
Just a brief question. Bourse, Bloomberg, and even IMF cut their forecast on South Africa. Why they do it despite the joining, maybe profitable joining to BRICS?
Decision by the BRICS leaders to look at the possibility of creating a BRICS credit rating agency. Now, many may say this is reactionary in nature, but let me assure you that this issue has been under discussion in BRICS for at least the past 4 years. It's been there under discussion, but now the leaders felt that we should start the process. You know, creating a new rating agency is not an overnight exercise. It's an exercise that will take at least the next 5 to 10 years before it's properly established and running. Now, many are saying we are doing this because of many of the BRICS countries, South Africa included, getting negative ratings from the established Standard & Poor's and the others, Moody's and the others, Fitch and so forth. But the idea is, again, why should you have global rating agencies that's only from the North? Speaking of the entire global population, don't we as countries of the South have the capability, the capacity, and the expertise to also create a rating agency that can not only focus on countries of the South, but also comment on the state of the global financial and economic health of the global community. So I think it's very important. You know, whenever you respond to this question is asked a lot in South Africa because of the pressure South Africa has been, especially this year, in receiving a downgrade by the major agencies. Is this process objective? Is it devoid of political interference? And I would leave that to you to decide on how these agencies operate and how they function, and the timing of downgrades when it is announced. And look, in most instances, and I spoke about the pressure that BRICS faces from the established order. And this is one of the established orders that I was referring to. The very sharp focus to comment on what is happening within BRICS countries, but yet not looking at what is happening in the countries that you operate from. Serious fault lines, serious challenges. As I said, I was in Brussels when you had the financial meltdown of 2008, and that was a result of poor governance. They will never use the word, I said it to them, that it was poor financial governance on your part. Greece would not have gone the way it went if there was proper checks and balances from within the European Union. You wouldn't have ended up with what was that time widely referred to as the BRICS group of countries, which were all in serious crisis. If you had proper due diligence and proper governance, financial governance, on your own member states, but yet you're very quick to go and pass judgment on the governance of us developing countries. So there's not a uniformity of approach. Thank you.
I've got one question I'd like to ask you about the upcoming future of the BRICS organization. We know that China is a member, emerging power, Brazil are one of great economies in the world, and are they going to like represent their own continent and in the upcoming future? As we know, United Nations almost failed, and it is not regional cooperation, BRICS, it is kind of global, and is it going to play a greater role in the upcoming future? Is it going to replace maybe the UN and be representative of its own region and continent and cooperate in economics and politics? And is it going to cooperate the whole world? I'm interested in. What do you expect? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think at the very outset I mentioned that BRICS is not meant to undermine multilateralism, it's not meant to undermine the UN system, but to find ways and means to strengthen the UN so that the UN once again rightfully occupies the space it should occupy as the representative organization of the global community that it was created for. But you can only have that if you have a UN that reflects the reality of the global community today. And unfortunately, the UN, especially your Security Council, does not do that. How can it be in this day and age, in 2016, that one entire continent with 1.1 billion people, Africa, is not part of the Security Council? How is it that possible? If it's supposed to be the highest decision-making body on global peace and security, and some of your most serious challenges on global peace and security is from the African continent. In fact, 50 to 60% of the UN agenda, UNSC agenda, focuses on Africa because of the challenges we have around peace and security. And yet there's no African voice there. 1945, fine, because the majority of African countries were under colonial rule. We were not independent. One can understand that. There was no logical choice to put an African country into a Security Council because we were all poor countries under the shackles of colonialism, racism and apartheid. But 2015, it's not the same Africa of 1945. So the BRICS is there to see how we can impact in a positive way and as a collective, a powerful collective, to change some of these unjust global environment that we find ourselves in. So going forward, yes, the BRICS will continue to consolidate because there's a deep commitment from all of the BRICS leaders, and this was stated at the Goa summit as it is stated at every summit, that every country has reaffirmed that they, being a member of BRICS, is a fundamental pillar of the foreign policy. Russia, President Putin stated this over and over. President Xi says this, President Temer now, he's the first summit he's attended as the new president of Brazil. He's given firm commitment that BRICS is of critical importance to Brazil. President Modi, as the host of the summit, has indicated that BRICS is fundamental to India and the future, and we ourselves as South Africa, we see this as very important. But we do not see BRICS as a closed community. That is why the outreach to dialogue with countries of the South, so that we are speaking to each other and see how we can work with each other to champion and to change the dynamics that still exist in terms of what happens on the global political, economic, financial space. That it has to change. It is changing. But as I said, when you sit around the table and you are the exclusive club, you don't want to add additional chairs to make space for others, even though the others have every right to be part of that club. So the UN will not be undermined by the BRICS, but strengthened by the BRICS, I believe, in the coming years. But strengthened in the sense that the UN should be what it's supposed to be, in terms of the true representation of the global community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The closing remarks will be given by Vice Rector for International Relations and Innovation, Mr. Bobek Somshriyek.
Dear guests, first of all, I would like to thank the Embassy of South Africa in Kazakhstan and the Embassy of Republic of Kazakhstan in South Africa for the selection of our university as the site seminar BRICS, all the seminar BRICS. And our university is ready to assist in carrying out this type of event. Thank you very much for our professor, Mr. Sooklal, for your information for today's lectures. I'm sure that your lectures will be useful for our students. And let me once again thank our visitors and wish them good luck.